Vicarious trauma is a real problem for interpreters because when we're interpreting, we interpret in the first person. So if a deaf person says, I have been through this experience, I would voice, I have been through this experience. And by saying that, you internalize some of it. So we then go away with this burden and nowhere necessarily to put that. That would, for me, probably be the number one thing, is just checking in and saying, is everything okay?
I could go to the town centre, sometimes I do go, and I see stalls and it's very interesting information and I want to ask them, but there's a barrier, a language barrier. So a hearing person would just go to the stall and it'd be smooth, they'd interact. For a deaf person, I have to think, and there's a barrier and I'm desperate to know more information, but it's not possible.
So I'm Andy Hesselwood and I'm a professional sign language interpreter. I've been a qualified sign language interpreter for 13 years. I was a trainee for around 3 years before that. And also, even before that, worked with deaf people. So I've probably been working in communication professions for about 17, 18 years. Sign language interpreters are used everywhere, anywhere in life, to enable communication between the hearing population and the deaf population. The stereotypes that people have of interpreters and deaf people range quite widely, I would say. Certainly when I first started being an interpreter, I was in my early 20s. I would rock up to a hospital appointment with an old lady and everyone would say, oh, isn't it great that you've brought your grandma to the hospital? And I think there's this thing that people don't necessarily realise, that interpreting is a profession. People think that we're just family members who go somewhere with a deaf person. Whether it's because I've got older or I've worked in different settings, I get that a lot less now than I used to when I first started. Or it could be that the profession is now more widely known. So people are realising that, interpreters are there, we're professionals, we turn up to an appointment the same as a doctor does, we do the appointment and then we leave. People automatically assume that I can read Braille. Blindness is a completely separate disability, but apparently as soon as you say that you work with deaf people, they go, oh, do you know Braille as well? So that's a stereotype that we get a lot. Stereotypes of deaf people. There seems to be an attitude that deaf people can't do a lot of things, and people are then surprised that I work as an interpreter in a certain setting because they don't understand how a deaf person would be there. I've done multiple driving theory tests and practical driving tests as an interpreter, going alongside a deaf person, and a lot of people are amazed that deaf people can drive. But there's no reason why they can't. I also work in performance interpreting, so that's going to music festivals, gigs, theatres, and interpreting that. A lot of people don't understand why you would need to interpret a song into sign language because they just assume that deaf people can't enjoy music, which again, absolutely wrong. There's a lot of technology out there now to help deaf people enjoy music, and deafness is such a range that actually you can still hear the music and feel the vibrations of the music without being able to hear the lyrics. And so having the interpreter there is just adding that lyrical storyline to what you can see, feel, and hear.
So my name is Aftab Hussain. I work as a freelance sign language instructor and I teach British Sign Language. So I teach in schools, churches, mosques, community centres. I teach as part of a HAF programme, which is a government-run scheme. It stands for Health, Activities and Food. I teach during the Easter, summer and winter programmes. I feel people patronise. They feel I'm lesser than them and they think of me as crazy or as an animal. So when I'm signing with deaf people and having a conversation, I often find people looking and they think I'm crazy or wild. I get this impression that they want me to calm down. So when I arrive at, say, example, schools, I find that people on the first impression are very stiff. So for the first week, I feel that they're quite stiff, even in movement and attitude. And second and third week, they start to warm up and understand. So the stereotypes are people are quite ignorant to a deaf person's need. Then there's a lack of communication between deaf people and normal people because there are barriers. And my work is to break those barriers, to have an interaction between both worlds, we could say, the hearing and the deaf. So people feel that they are superior to deaf people, and that for deaf people it's not possible to achieve. But it is, I can achieve, and I can get to the same level. My disability does not prevent that.
The important things for people to realise about us as interpreters are, I think it's important to remember that we are people within a process. Historically, there was a training scheme that essentially said that I am just an interpreter and that I am a robot in a room. Somebody talks, I output that in sign language, and I don't have feelings, I don't have emotions, I should be ignored. Thankfully, I think we're moving away from that now. But as the interpreter, I am as much a part of what's going on as anybody else. General day-to-day interpreting, it's not a problem. But there are times where we as interpreters have to interpret things that are not very nice. And vicarious trauma is a real problem for interpreters because when we're interpreting, we interpret in the first person. So if a deaf person says, I have been through this experience, I would voice, I have been through this experience. And by saying that, you internalize some of it. And I think a lot of the time at the end of an appointment, everybody goes, thanks, off you go. And we're still left with that burden of everything that we've internalized and then reproduced into a target language. Deaf people will get support from whatever support agencies they need, and the professionals that we're working with will have their own internal support systems, counselling or whatever. A lot of us as interpreters are freelance, self-employed people. So we then go away with this burden and nowhere necessarily to put that. And I think sometimes, I don't think people realise how much we can internalise what's happening in a room. That would, for me, probably be the number one thing, is just checking in and saying, is everything okay, before we leave. So when I first started interpreting, I had a friend who was an interpreter who I looked up to a lot. And she said that sometimes you come out of a job and you just need to sit in your car and cry. And I always thought that's a really, really weird thing to say about a job that you supposedly enjoy doing. I have not yet been in that situation, but I have been very close. And I think it probably happens more than you realise because of that whole thing of we just take on so much that you just come out of it and you need to process it in some way or another. Everybody's got their own coping strategies for that. Mine is ice hockey, take it out on somebody else. But everybody has to cope with things in one way or another. I think knowing when you are the right person for a job or the wrong person for a job is quite difficult for interpreters. People assume that because you're an interpreter, you can interpret anything, which To an extent, yes. But certain jobs are better for certain people. I think a lot of the time, as a profession of interpreters, we worry too much that there isn't going to be an interpreter, so we will then take a job that isn't necessarily right because some access is better than no access. And that can be quite damaging. Emergency situations for deaf people have always been quite of a challenge. My typical diary is fully booked around 2 months in advance, which obviously doesn't cope well with emergencies. It's that thing of, yes, maybe I don't particularly want to go out at 1 o'clock in the morning to a hospital, but if I don't and nobody else does, and that deaf person has no communication to explain what the pain is or what's happening, hospitals will have to make decisions based on life or death, whether they've got consent or not. And so a lot of the time you'll find that deaf people have procedures that are done because they needed to be done, but they're completely unaware of what's happened. And I don't like the fact that that can be something just because I didn't go out. So I will always try to respond to an emergency call out if I need to, as will a lot of my colleagues. There's not enough of us around, but there are enough to make sure that we cover the basics. And I don't know any interpreter who would sit and not go to an emergency. There's plenty of other reasons why you can't go, but if there is an emergency and you are available, we would always say yes. There is a massive lack of sign language professionals within the UK. I'm not 100% sure on the current figures, but I believe that it's between 60 and 70,000 British Sign Language users, who that is first language BSL users, and the numbers of registered interpreters are fluctuating between about 1,200 and 1,500. So if you've got, at best case, you've got 60,000 deaf people and 1,500 interpreters. It's a lot of deaf people per interpreter. We're looking at each interpreter is having to cover roughly 50 people on a daily basis. Not all of those deaf people need an interpreter full time, but as more and more companies are becoming accepting of deaf people within the workforce, or are becoming forced to accept deaf people in the workforce, depending on which way you look at it, there is more need for interpreters within the workplace. That is usually a full day booking, which then means that that's a full day in your diary where you can't go and do hospital appointments, police stations, doctors. So interpreters are being pulled out of the community to work within workplace environments, which is then causing a massive shortfall for emergency situations with interpreters.
My first language is BSL. English is my second language, and everything I do rely on an interpreter, and I have to wait for an interpreter. So interpreters are very difficult because you cannot book them in one day. Roughly, you'd have to book an interpreter 2 months in advance. If it's an emergency, if I'm ill, if I've got an injury and I go to the hospital or a GP, I cannot have an appointment straight away because there's no interpreter, and I can often wait months, and that really gets my blood boiling. Meetings as well, if an interpreter falls ill, that can be another problem because meetings get cancelled because there's no communication. So I really rely on an interpreter, and it's very difficult to find them. So I lose business and my work does get affected. When I'm trying to get my business to grow and I'm struggling to find an interpreter, it's a huge loss.
The best way that people can support the deaf community and interpreters is probably through the British Deaf Association, which is the BDA. They do a lot of campaigning about deaf rights and making things more accessible for deaf people. getting equality for deaf people. Recent successes are the GCSE in sign language, which they had a lot to do with, and getting BSL recognised as an official language of the UK. But there's always more work ongoing. So checking up, just having a look at what they're doing, sharing the information. There's quite often times where they'll need sort of MP support in the work that they do. So they'll provide a letter that you can just edit and then send on to your MP to try and get that backing at the parliamentary level. So yeah, the BDA is an amazing way forward. Access arrangements at any event or any company are quite often seen as a last minute addition, where you will plan an event and then suddenly think, oh, we need to make this accessible for deaf people. For me, that's the wrong way around. Access needs to be the first thought when you're planning anything. So it needs to be, I'm thinking about doing this event, can it be accessible for people with disabilities or deaf people? If you are planning any corporate event or any kind of event, if you just have interpreters there anyway, if a deaf person wants to come, they can. And you've completely removed a barrier. You can advertise saying this event is going to be accessible for deaf people, and then they know that they can just rock up the same as anybody else can, and be able to access everything that's going on.
There was a campaign which BSL has been put onto the curriculum now through years of campaigning, and this should be implemented in September 2025. And I hope people take that opportunity to opt for sign language courses and either contact myself as a way forward to learning and breaking the barrier.
If you're interested in learning basic sign language, most city colleges will offer some form of sign language course. Also, there are deaf centres around. There's a lot less than there used to be, but most major cities will have a deaf club of some sort, and they will quite often run their own sign language courses there. If you are looking at taking a sign language course, the most important thing is to check that your teacher is deaf. Although there are good hearing sign language teachers, in my opinion, you always want to learn a language from someone who has that language as their first language. The best way to learn sign language is learning it from a deaf professional, a deaf person who has lived experience of the culture, which is part of the language, and their use of language is just always going to be better. You know, it doesn't matter how qualified and how long you've been working as an interpreter. Sign language is always going to be my second language. Whereas for a deaf person, it's their first language. And also, it's a job that a deaf person can do, and can do very well, and can do better than a hearing person. So why should a hearing person take a job that rightfully should be done by a deaf person? The thing that I love most about my job is the people that I get to meet and the places that I get to see. Because every day is different, I get to go all over the place. Some days are very boring, they're in the same place, they're in an office, and it's not that exciting. But some places that you get to go and see, I wouldn't have had those experiences anywhere else. I've worked with very big bands. I've travelled the world. I've worked in Sri Lanka. I've worked in Nepal. All being well, in November, I am climbing Mount Everest as an interpreter for a deaf group of people who are climbing Everest. The job opens doors to be able to see things, but just the people that you meet and the everyday life moments that you get to be a part of as well. We're there for everything. Interpreters can be there for babies being born, all the way through to somebody's funeral. And you become a part of the life, you share a part of the life. It's not always a good part of the life, but you're just spending time with people and you're just connecting. And that's the best thing about my job.